So I know you're all wondering, what is science-based medicine? What is it? What do we do? So to give the quick overview, we have a number of agendas, a number of things that we're trying to accomplish. First of all, we like to explore just the very idea of the relationship between basic and clinical science and the practice of medicine. Obviously, we believe that medicine should be science-based, but then, of course, we have to answer the question, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be science-based? Part of that is knowing how to evaluate the medical literature. It's one thing to say that I'm going to base my clinical treatments and decisions on science, but you have to know how to read the scientific literature and how to interpret it in order to be able to do that. But we go beyond that. Further, we think it's critically important for pretty much at every stage of the practice of medicine and the science of medicine to understand critical thinking as its own skill set. I see what happens every day to very knowledgeable physicians, for example, who just lack certain critical thinking skills, and therefore that hampers their ability to properly apply science to medicine. Further, we lobby and advocate for science-based rational regulation. Jan Bellamy is going to be talking about that specifically later. We also understand that it's not enough for the profession to understand science and the relationship between science and medicine. Our patients need to understand it too, which means the public needs to understand it. So we promote the public understanding of science in general, of critical thinking, of skepticism, and of science-based medicine, the relationship between science and medicine. And then we also talk about how to put it all together into clinical practice. I'm not going to be talking about all of these things over the next 30 minutes, but that's all the things that we do. Okay, obviously there's a great need for this. There is a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. Most of the information on the internet is health-based information. I think it was just about 5 years ago that we surpassed pornography as the most common information on the internet. Took us a while, took about 20 or 30 years, but finally we did it. So people go online to get their medical information. And to figure out, should they vaccinate their kids? Should they buy a supplement? Should they go to a chiropractor? That's how they access their information. The internet is a marketplace. A lot of the information out there is trying to sell you something. And you need science-based medicine and critical thinking skills just to navigate that. Dr. Oz, one of the most popular doctors now in the country, unfortunately, and we know from actual research, not just our subjective experience, that the vast majority of the information that he tells his audience is wrong, or it's completely unsourced. He has no scientific basis for it, and even when he does, he's completely overselling the claims. All right, so first, let's define what we mean by science as it relates in the context of science-based medicine. Science has some what we call generic intellectual virtues. These are not unique to science. These are just good things for any intellectual endeavor. Reasonably accounts for all evidence. What that means is you can't just pick and choose the evidence that you want. You need to look at all the evidence that's available. Utilizes valid logic. If you make an internally inconsistent logical statement, that you're probably not going to be led to a valid conclusion. Intellectually thorough, rigorous, and methodical. Reasonably fair and unbiased in judgments. Unfortunately, we don't have enough information so that we can say that we have the absolute answer to every medical or clinical question. If we could, computers can practice medicine, but they can't. So at some point, almost always, there's a judgment call. And adheres to standards of ethics and professionalism as well. So it's incredible to me still that people will respond to our position by saying, well, we don't need science to know what works and what doesn't work. Well, if that's your position, then tell me which of these things you don't need. Are you saying that you want to cherry pick your evidence, use poor logic, be unfair and biased? Of course, nobody says that, but that is the implication of what they're saying. Now, roughly 20, 25 years ago, a movement came to being within medicine called evidence-based medicine. A lot of people responded at this time by asking, well, what have we been doing up until now? I thought that we were doing evidence-based medicine. But evidence-based medicine is, overall, a very positive movement, although it has its limitations, and that's sort of the crux of what I'm going to be talking about, is we need to go beyond evidence-based medicine and fix its deficits. Evidence-based medicine assumes that products and practices that actually work are better than ones that don't work. Again, I think that's a pretty common premise. I think most people will agree that they want to use treatments that are safe and effective. And of course, it uses evidence as the measure. Once you agree with the premise that we want a treatment to work, then you have to ask the question, well, how do we know if it works or not? Scientific evidence is the way to know. However, it focuses too much on clinical evidence and ignores prior probability, which is prior probability derives from all scientific evidence, basic science evidence, evidence even outside of medicine and physics and chemistry, physiology, as well as related clinical evidence, maybe not directly focusing on that question. So evidence-based medicine looks at only a subset of the evidence, and it looks at the most tricky, although it is the most directly relevant, it is the most tricky and most difficult type of evidence. That is clinical evidence with people. People are very messy and are not very uniform, and it's hard to get really reliable data when you're looking at outcomes with people. So evidence-based medicine assumes that everyone's playing fair, but we know that that's not the case, does not sufficiently account for fraud, publication bias, and researcher bias. And then its big fatal flaw is that it ignores prior probability, explicitly ignores prior probability, and does not adequately consider the big picture of the entire literature. So again, it kind of puts voluntary blinders on when looking at the scientific evidence. So why is this approach inadequate? What's wrong with that approach? Well, the clinical evidence is highly problematic. And if you're not intimately familiar with the medical literature as a living organism, you're going to come to the wrong conclusions. And in fact, we are systematically coming to at least premature conclusions when relying solely on the clinical evidence. John Unitas published a series of articles, but his seminal paper essentially said why most published research findings are false. If you look at the literature and just look at all published studies, most of the individual published studies actually come to the wrong conclusion. That doesn't mean that most of what physicians are doing is wrong. It just means that it takes a long time, anywhere between 5 and 20 years, for any clinical question to work itself out in the literature. And if you look back, like once we have the answer, once we know what the answer is, because we've done multiple definitive clinical trials and everybody agrees, as much as we could know anything, this treatment either works or it doesn't work. Then you look back at the previous 20 years of research, you realize that a lot of the preliminary studies leading up to that final conclusion actually came to the wrong conclusion. That's a problem unless you know how to put it all into context. Of course, until you get to that definitive research, if you're just looking at the preliminary research and relying upon it, you're likely to come to the wrong conclusion. Part of this is because individual studies are easy to manipulate. They're easy to manipulate, I say innocently, meaning you're not intending to falsify data or to manipulate the data. Or maybe you know you're doing something that's not rigorous or exactly the best practice. But people underestimate how easy it is to manufacture positive results by doing things that seem to be fairly innocent, such as just deciding which variables to observe or which comparisons to make, or when to stop collecting data. One actually fairly common process or practice is for researchers to keep collecting data until they get to a statistically significant result, then they stop and publish. Now, of course, that gives them the opportunity to essentially, if the data is engaging in a drunkard's walk, randomly wandering around whatever the true effect size is, if it stumbles across 0.05 statistical significance, then you stop there because you're monitoring it and deciding when to stop. That's a form of cherry picking. That's cheating. You're picking out one point in time or one subset of the evidence because it's statistically significant. You have to know what your endpoints are before you look at the data. Unfortunately, this type of misconduct that leads to these false positive studies is fairly common. A 2009 PLOS One systematic review found 33% of scientists that they surveyed, that were surveyed in the studies that they were reviewing, admitted to doing questionable practices, exactly the practices that lead to false positive studies, that can massage the data. Or as some people say, you torture the data until it confesses, right? You keep doing these subtle manipulations until you get over your 0.05 and then you're good to go. In fact, they also found that a lot of published studies cluster suspiciously around the 0.05 barely statistically significant level. Now, if the statistics were genuine, you should see a nice bell curve. You should see more of a range of statistical significance numbers. But when there's this peak at 0.05, that means that people are doing what they need to just get to the 0.05 level. And then sometimes researchers make mistakes. Research is complicated. Statistics is complicated. A 2011 Nature Neuroscience review found that 50% of the papers they looked at had a common statistical error. Specifically comparing treatment to baseline and placebo to baseline, but never comparing treatment to placebo, which is what you're supposed to do. And in fact, since this paper came out, I've been paying close attention to this, and just about a year ago, the FDA approved a device for the treatment of migraines based upon one study that committed that statistical error. The baseline to placebo was not significant, but the treatment to baseline was. But the treatment compared to placebo was not significant. So by a proper interpretation, the device didn't work. But they allowed the device to be approved based upon this incorrect statistics, which is very interesting. Now, journals are the gatekeepers of the scientific literature, and they're highly problematic as well. The problem with the different types of journals is that their business models may contain perverse incentives that distorts the studies that get published. Not every study gets published, so any decision process as to what gets published is a new opportunity for bias to enter in. In 2013, there's now a famous scientific magazine, Sting, on open access journals, where the researcher submitted hundreds of versions of the same completely bogus, horrible study that he manufactured to be as bad as possible to like 300 or so open access journals, and over half published the study, which means that their peer review process is either non-existent or worthless. The problem with open access journals is that their business model is that they charge researchers to publish studies. So you could make money by producing a lot of crappy open access journals and publishing a lot of crap. So guess what happens? A lot of crap gets published. And that is diluting out the literature. Now, to be fair, this was published in a traditional journal using the business model of having a high impact factor and then getting subscriptions and advertising. Nobel laureate Randy Schekman announced recently that he was boycotting Science, Nature, and Cell, the three top journals in biological and medical sciences. Must be nice to have the luxury to say, yeah, I'm going to boycott the three most prestigious journals in the world. But he did that to make a point that he feels that these journals, this is not the flip side, that because of their emphasis on impact factor, getting the articles that they published in the press and cited by other articles, that motivates them to publish studies which are provocative, that establish something new or reverse something that we previously thought was established. Those are exactly the kinds of studies that are most likely to turn out to be wrong in the future. Those articles, the articles that in fact that have the highest impact factor, are the most likely to be retracted later for problems. They're the most likely to be reversed by later research. And so the most prestigious journals have this bias towards publishing studies which are wrong. Think about that. Think about that, how that is distorting the literature, the scientific evidence that we're relying upon to make our clinical decisions. Okay. Very quickly, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, and I know David Gorsch is going to talk about this a little bit later. Science-based medicine, one of the things that we have been doing is really thinking deeply about how data should be analyzed. The traditional way that data is analyzed is with what we call the p-value. The problem with the p-value is a number of things wrong with it. It tends to overemphasize false positives, and also partly it asks the wrong question. It asks, what's the probability that the effect size would be what it is or greater given the null hypothesis, which is a pretty nerdy description, but that's the actual definition. But most people flip that in their minds, and they say, what's the probability that the hypothesis is true? But that's not what the p-value is, and you can't flip it that way. And when you do, you get a completely distorted view of the significance of the data. We prefer to use, or at least augment this with a Bayesian analysis, which asks the actual correct question, what is the probability of the hypothesis given the data, right? That's what we really want to ask. One journal, the Basic and Applied Social Psychology, recently banned the use of p-values in their journals. They will no longer accept papers that use p-values. That's a little draconian, but they're doing it for a very specific point. It's a way of massaging statistical significance out of insufficient data, and they think it's distorting the data, the published studies in a bad direction. Okay. This is, I think, just summarizes all the problems with evidence-based medicine. Homeopathic oscillococcinum for preventing and treating influenza and influenza-like syndromes. This is a Cochrane review. Cochrane is the standard bearer for evidence-based medicine. They concluded there is insufficient data to recommend the treatment, but oscillococcinum is promising and warrants further research. Oscillococcinum doesn't exist. It was a misperception of air bubbles on slides that a homeopath thought were little oscillating bacteria. They don't exist. Now, he found them on a slide of diseased tissue and said that must be what's causing the disease. But then he found them on slides of every tissue, and so instead of concluding that it was just a ubiquitous artifact, he concluded that it was the cause of all disease. Because what other conclusion are you going to come to, right? And for some reason, just the quirkiness of history, he found more of these oscillococcinum in the livers and lungs of ducks. So homeopathic oscillococcinum is diluted duck liver for that reason. And as you know, homeopathic dilutions often are to such a degree that there isn't any original substance left. So it doesn't really matter that oscillococcinum doesn't exist. So this treatment is the equivalent of fairy dust diluted out of existence. But Cochrane believes it's promising, and we should invest more money in research on this diluted fairy dust. That's the problem with evidence-based medicine. Science-based medicine takes a different approach. It agrees, yep, evidence matters, but we need to acknowledge that all scientific evidence has to agree with itself across all disciplines, basic and clinical. You can't just pull out one type of evidence in isolation. It considers plausibility, explicitly considers plausibility. The degree of clinical evidence that you need to be convincing has to vary based upon the basic science plausibility of the claim that you're making. Considers the overall pattern in the literature. Sometimes, as studies get better, effect sizes disappear. That's an important pattern to recognize. It's not just looking at individual studies or even just doing a meta-analysis or systematic review. You have to see, is this a pattern that historically, in retrospect, is consistent with a treatment that is real or a treatment that is not real? Considers proper uses of types of evidence and requires careful consideration of definitions of variables. So these are the kind of errors that are made. So if there were a science-based medicine review of the same literature on oscillococcinum, this is what it would say, something like this. Given the extreme scientific implausibility of homeopathy in general and oscillococcinum specifically, the weak and preliminary available data does not significantly alter the prior probability of 0. This treatment should be abandoned and further research would be unethical. It's a very different conclusion from the evidence-based medicine review, and that's why we think we need to move forward to science-based medicine. The proponents of alternative integrative medicine don't like plausibility. They don't like considering prior plausibility. Guess why? Because their treatments sometimes lack any prior plausibility. In fact, David Gorski and I wrote an article explaining that, why we think prior plausibility is important. And in response to that, Vohra and Boone, who are doing homeopathy research, wrote a response saying, we shouldn't consider prior plausibility, and we don't need to rely on rigorous clinical data. We can use poor, preliminary, weak clinical data, even on highly implausible treatments. And they said both of those things at the same time in one paper, which is lovely. This is the paper they were responding to that David and I wrote. So I think I'm getting to my last slide. All of this gets to the question, when do we adopt new treatments? That's the question. There's always going to be some spectrum of evidence. You're going to be somewhere along that continuum of evidence. You need to know, well, when do we get over that magic threshold where a treatment is more likely to be beneficial, more likely to work than to not work? And the answer is it depends. I can't give you an algorithm. It does take some judgment. It depends on a lot of clinical variables. But what we do know is that we're probably adopting treatments too soon, because a lot of them are being reversed when later more definitive research is being done. In this one review, 40.2% of studies were found to be ineffective. These were practices that were already being used, but then they were studied with more definitive studies. A 2005 review looked at 101 promising new therapeutic targets, and it found that 20, 30 years later, only 5 led to any treatments, and only 1 was actually being regularly used, and only in the most restrictive indication. So every time you hear, oh, this new therapeutic target is going to cure all disease, well, that's just not the way it turns out. So I'm at the end of my time. Again, we'll be taking questions later on in the day, so if you have any questions, just save them for me. Again, thank you very much. Thanks to Nexus for allowing a full day of science-based medicine. We have a lot to talk to you guys about and to teach you guys, more than we can cram into one day, but we'll definitely do our best. Thanks.